Imagine a grand mansion in Beverly Hills where silence is worth more than happiness. Inside lives Ethan Grant, a millionaire who has everything except peace. Since losing his wife, he's been trying to raise his teenage daughter, Sophie, a rebel with a wounded heart who's already made dozens of employees quit. But one day, the unexpected happens. A humble woman, a maid named Maria Lopez, walks through those gates. No one could have guessed that she, with her quiet courage and gentle soul, would change that family's fate forever. But be warned, this isn't just a love story. It's a story about transformation, about how kindness can shatter pride, and how humility can touch even the heart of a millionaire. So before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, turn on the notifications, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because what comes next will prove that sometimes the impossible only needs one thing: someone brave enough to love for real. They say some opportunities come wrapped in nervousness, and that's exactly how Maria Lopez climbed the hill of Beverly Hills that morning. A single mother, a devoted cleaning lady, her heart raced as she faced gates that seemed to touch the sky. Every step was a mix of fear and hope. She didn't know it yet, but that day would mark the beginning of something that would change not only her destiny, but also that of a millionaire tired of his own wealth. Ethan Grant was the picture of elegant loneliness. He had everything money could buy, except peace. The kind of man surrounded by luxury but haunted by the weight of what money could never replace. Maria noticed it at first glance. The flawless suit, the practiced smile, the empty eyes. It was strange how even the most powerful millionaire could look fragile when the silence of his own house echoed louder than the sound of success. As Maria cleaned the mansion's towering glass windows, she realized that the shine of things has nothing to do with the shine of the soul. What good is all this gold if no one laughs in here, she thought. It was the kind of thought born from someone who knows the value of simplicity. Those who have scrubbed floors to raise a child understand that worth doesn't live in labels. It lives in purpose. And that was exactly what the house lacked: purpose. But the real challenge wasn't the size of the mansion. It was the size of the storm named Sophie Grant. The millionaire's daughter was a teenage hurricane, capable of scaring away any employee. It was as if the whole world was to blame for her pain. And Maria, with her almost saintly patience, understood that behind every shout there was an unspoken cry for help. Sometimes, love disguises itself as trouble. Deep down, Sophie didn't hate people. She hated the emptiness, the absence of a mother, the silence of a father, the golden loneliness of someone who grows up surrounded by privilege, but without a single sincere hug. And Maria, without realizing it, brought a breath of humanity into that sterile universe, like a breeze entering through a forgotten window. The millionaire watched from afar, unsure whether to admire her courage or fear what she was awakening inside him. The first morning was a test. In a fit of anger, Sophie threw a vase on the floor, so expensive it could have paid Maria's rent for a whole year. The crash echoed through the house, followed by heavy silence. Everyone expected a scandal, a cry, an immediate firing. But Maria, calm as someone who's faced far worse storms, simply took a deep breath, picked up the broom, and asked, "Did you hurt yourself, dear?" Ethan was speechless. That simple question disarmed something inside him. No one had spoken to his daughter like that in a long time, not with anger, but with care. Maria turned chaos into compassion, and that's an art not everyone masters. It's like wiping a dirty mirror and suddenly seeing your own reflection. The cleaning lady, without realizing it, had cleaned something far deeper than the floor. She had touched hearts. That night, the millionaire paced back and forth, trying to decide what to do. She should leave, he told himself. But deep down, something stopped him. Maybe it was the serene way Maria faced the impossible, or maybe it was the memory of her shy smile as she said goodbye. There are things the heart understands long before the mind, and Ethan, for the first time in years, chose to listen to his. Outside, the lights of Beverly Hills sparkled like jewels scattered in the dark. Inside the mansion, however, something else had begun to shine. Maria, without knowing it, had lit the first spark of change. a small flame, but powerful enough to set destinies ablaze. The millionaire didn't know it yet, but his story, and his daughter's, was about to enter a new chapter, shaped by a simple cleaning lady. The sound of shattered glass still echoed through the hallways when Maria knelt quietly to gather the broken vase. No trace of anger, no sign of fear, only calm. The mansion seemed frozen in time, watching that simple woman turn chaos into serenity. Ethan, the millionaire, stood at a distance, unable to understand how anyone could react with such peace in the face of such defiance. Maria didn't argue, didn't defend herself, didn't apologize. She simply cleaned the floor and asked Sophie if she was all right, as if she could see beyond the girl's fury. That simple gesture unsettled everyone around. Even the oldest. Servants exchanged surprised glances. They knew no one survived the wrath of the millionaire's daughter. But that cleaning lady was different. She carried a quiet courage, rare and disarming. Ethan was torn between reason and curiosity. Reason told him to fire Maria immediately. Rules were rules after all. But something inside him hesitated. There was too much dignity in the way she carried herself. It was as if she were protected by an invisible force, the same that makes someone keep walking with faith, even when the ground threatens to give way. He decided to observe her instead of judging her. That same night, dinner was a theater of appearances. The table was flawless, the silverware aligned, the silence cutting. Then Margaret Grant, Ethan's mother, appeared. Impeccable in a pearl gray dress, discreet jewelry, and eyes sharp as blades. When she saw Maria standing in the background, bent over the sideboard, she released a cold remark. "She's not the right kind for this house." The air grew even heavier. Maria heard it, but remained composed. True humility doesn't bow to disdain. She kept serving the table with a natural elegance that only irritated Margaret more. Ethan noticed his mother's discomfort, but stayed silent. It was like watching two worlds collide, the cold rigidity of the elite and the warm simplicity of someone who had learned to survive without privilege. After dinner, the house fell silent, but Maria was still awake, folding sheets and tidying up what was left of the day. Then she heard a faint sound from upstairs, sobbing. She recognized Sophie's crying behind a closed door. She froze for a few seconds, torn between duty and heart. Entering would cross a line she knew, but ignoring it would mean letting a soul suffer alone. With quiet steps, she climbed the stairs and stopped at the door. The dark hallway seemed to guard secrets. Maria took a deep breath, hesitated for a moment, then did the unthinkable. She turned the doorknob and went in. The room was dimly lit, covered in torn photographs and the shadows of the past. Sophie, her eyes red, turned around, startled, ready to scream. But when she saw Maria, she froze. No words were spoken, only the gaze of a woman who understood pain without needing explanations. Maria's presence in that forbidden room was an act of pure intuition, the kind of courage born when love speaks louder than fear. Outside, the wind rattled the mansion's windows, as if the whole world held its breath at that improbable meeting between the cleaning lady and the millionaire's daughter. Meanwhile, downstairs, Ethan stood by the window, uneasy, feeling that something important was happening above. A subtle, invisible, yet profound shift. He didn't know it yet, but that night would mark the beginning of a silent transformation. The maid who didn't run away was about to break a cycle that neither money nor power had ever been able to fix. The door opened with a faint creak, as if it had guarded secrets for far too long. The air inside was dense, heavy with memories and sorrow. Torn photographs covered the desk and floor, and the faint scent of someone long gone still lingered. Sophie, sitting on the bed, glared at the intruder who had dared to enter that forbidden space. But Maria, the cleaning lady, didn't step back. She walked calmly, like someone who knows that silence can be the deepest form of respect. The room looked like a portrait of a broken heart. Heavy curtains kept the light from entering, and a cracked mirror reflected fragments of a past no one wanted to face. Sophie, her eyes swollen, held a torn photo of her mother, the late Mrs. Grant. That was where all her pain hid. Among memories, the millionaire, her father, had tried to erase. Maria looked around, and for an instant, saw not a room, but a scream trapped in time. She moved closer without saying a word. Her steps were soft, almost reverent, and every movement seemed to carry something invisible. Empathy. Sophie stood trembling with anger, her eyes filled with tears. "Get out!" she shouted, her voice cracking between rage and fear. But the cleaning lady stayed. And in that moment, there was no hierarchy, no job, no social divide, only two wounded souls recognizing each other. Maria took a deep breath before speaking. She told Sophie about losing her husband, about the days when the world felt too heavy to face alone with a small child. Her voice didn't shake. It was firm and tender, like someone who had learned to forgive her own pain. Sophie, still teary-eyed, began to listen, not because she wanted to, but because she needed to. It was the first time anyone had spoken to her without guilt or fear. Their pains, so different yet so alike, crossed in the air like invisible threads. Maria spoke with simplicity, and each word fell like balm over Sophie's wounded heart. The girl began to breathe slower, her anger melting away in the calm rhythm of that voice. "I know what it's like to lose someone you love," Maria said softly, her eyes saying what words could not. For the first time, Sophie didn't shout. She just looked silently. Downstairs, the millionaire paced restlessly through the living room. Something troubled him, a feeling he couldn't explain. The clock struck midnight as he climbed the stairs, guided by an instinct he didn't understand. When he reached the hallway, he heard faint voices and stopped before the slightly open door. Inside, he saw Maria sitting beside his daughter, not intruding, not overstepping, simply present, genuine human. The image disarmed him. For years, he had tried to control chaos with discipline, money, and rules. But there, before him, was something no therapist or tutor had achieved. His daughter, finally at peace. And at the center of it all stood a simple woman in a green uniform, who never imagined she could hold such power. When Maria noticed him, she slowly stood up. The look they exchanged was deep, full of meanings that words couldn't hold. Ethan, unsure what to say, simply asked what she was doing there. Before she could answer, Margaret Grant appeared in the hallway, her face tight with outrage. The air shifted. What had been tenderness a moment ago turned into judgment. The forbidden room had become the stage for a new conflict. Sophie, gathering unexpected courage, stood up and said, "It was my fault. She was only trying to help." Her voice cut through the tension, breaking her grandmother's control and her father's silence. Maria froze in surprise. The millionaire saw something in his daughter he hadn't seen in years: honesty. And as Margaret stared in fury, fate quietly began to weave what was to come, a battle between pride and transformation. The silence after the revelation was louder than any scream. Margaret Grant stared at Maria Lopez as one might look at a threat disguised as virtue. There was pride in her gaze, the old kind inherited from generations who had never bowed to anyone. Beside her, Ethan, the millionaire, tried to make sense of what had happened, torn between reason and instinct. And among them, Sophie stood firm, protecting the cleaning lady as if guarding something sacred. Margaret was the first to break the silence. Her voice was sharp, wrapped in a tone of authority that filled the hallway. "She invaded my granddaughter's room. That's unacceptable." Her words cut through the air like blades. But Maria didn't defend herself with shouting or excuses. She simply kept her serene posture, her steady gaze, and her unshakable respect. The kind of dignity that can't be bought or taught, only born from the soul. Ethan tried to intervene. He said he wanted to hear what had really happened, but his mother silenced him with a cold gesture. "There's nothing to explain. This woman doesn't belong here." It was the same quiet judgment that had driven many away before her, but this time something was different. Maria's calm, authentic presence created an unease too real to ignore, as if her simplicity revealed the cracks in a world built on appearances. Maria took a deep breath and spoke softly. She explained that she had heard the girl crying and couldn't walk away. "I only wanted to help," she said, without drama, without defense. Her voice carried such purity that, for a brief moment, the air itself seemed to soften. Even Ethan, a man accustomed to negotiations and calculated words, realized there was no strategy here, only truth. But Margaret did not retreat. "Too much kindness often hides intentions," she replied, her tone cold and her eyes narrow. Each word seemed designed to push Maria back into her place, the place of someone who serves, not someone who changes. The millionaire, watching the tension, felt something shift inside him. For the first time, he began to wonder if the mother he so deeply respected might be trapped in a world that no longer existed. Sophie, gripped by unexpected courage, stepped forward. "It was my fault, Grandma. I asked her to stay." The teenager's voice echoed through the corridor like a crack in an old wall. Margaret's face stiffened. Her pride wavered. Ethan, silent, watched his daughter defend the cleaning lady with the same passion she once used to rebel against everything. It was the birth of a new loyalty right before his eyes. Maria, humble as ever, tried to interrupt. She said she didn't want to cause trouble, that she would leave if it was best. But Sophie held her hand, tears glistening in her eyes. "Don't go," she whispered. The scene was simple, yet powerful. The same girl who once drove everyone away now begged for the one presence that made her feel safe. The millionaire realized something profound had shifted within his home. Margaret turned away, feeling control slip through her fingers. The hallway seemed smaller, the air heavier. Everything she believed to be orderly was beginning to unravel. "Ethan, you need to make a decision," she said firmly, clinging to the last thread of authority. But in her son's eyes, she saw hesitation, and perhaps something more dangerous. Admiration for the woman she so despised. The millionaire took a slow breath, looked at his mother, then at Maria. "She stays." The words echoed, heavy and freeing at the same time. Margaret didn't reply. She simply turned, rigid, and descended the stairs in silence. In the corridor remained three people: a teenager at peace, a man awakening to life, and a cleaning lady who, without realizing it, had just changed the destiny of an entire family. The lights of Beverly Hills shimmered brighter than ever that night. Luxury cars lined up outside, and the flashes of cameras turned into their own spectacle. Inside the grand ballroom of the St. Raphael Hotel, the millionaire Ethan Grant was preparing for the most anticipated charity event of the year. His tailored suit, composed expression, and commanding presence made him the perfect image of success. But what unsettled him most wasn't the press or the investors. It was knowing that among the crowd of elegant faces would be Maria Lopez, the cleaning lady who had changed his home. And though he didn't admit it, his heart. Maria arrived quietly, blending in with the staff. She wore a simple navy blue dress she had bought from a thrift store. No jewelry, no heavy makeup, only the natural elegance of someone whose confidence came from within. Her presence stood out not for its extravagance, but for its authenticity. She was like a soft note in a loud orchestra, subtle yet impossible to ignore. Margaret Grant watched from afar, her expression one of restrained panic. For her, this ballroom was sacred ground, reserved for the elite, for those whose names carried legacy and expectation. To see a cleaning lady walking among the guests felt almost like a trespass. Yet for Ethan, that contrast was strangely freeing. For the first time, the lines between status and sincerity were beginning to blur. The millionaire, surrounded by businessmen and photographers, pretended to follow the conversations, but his eyes searched for her. When he finally found her, time seemed to slow. Maria stood near the drink table, adjusting the apron of another staff member. A simple gesture, yet one that revealed her essence. She cared even when no one asked her to. Ethan smiled faintly, unaware that Margaret was watching every move with suspicion. At the center of the ballroom, a well-known socialite approached Maria with a sharp smile. "Interesting to see you here. Did they run out of glassware? Or is it the new policy to let the help mingle with the guests?" She sneered, her tone dripping with mockery. The air went cold. A few laughed awkwardly. Most looked away. Maria stayed silent, her posture upright, her eyes calm. Sometimes silence is the most graceful reply. It was Sophie who broke the tension. Dressed in a silver gown, the teenager stepped forward and said clearly enough for all to hear, "She's part of our family, and she deserves to be here more than most." The room fell still. Margaret's pride cracked and Ethan felt his throat tighten. That single act of courage from his daughter spoke louder than any defense could. The millionaire crossed the ballroom. The music seemed to fade as he approached Maria. He stopped before her, unfazed by the whispers and the judging eyes. "You look stunning tonight," he said, smiling sincerely. The murmur across the room was instant. No one expected such boldness. And then, in a simple yet defiant gesture, he took her hand. The touch lasted only a moment, but it was enough to turn the gala into something far greater than a charity event. It became a statement. The photographers didn't miss a beat. Flashes erupted like fireworks, capturing the exact moment that would ignite a scandal. Margaret stood frozen, torn between fury and disbelief. The sight of her son, the model millionaire, holding the cleaning lady's hand in front of all Beverly Hills was unthinkable. To her, it wasn't love. It was rebellion. But to Ethan, it was freedom. For the first time, there was no mask, no facade, only truth. As the orchestra resumed its melody and conversations rose again, he looked at Maria and saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen in years. Peace. The grand ballroom, full of artificial light and empty smiles, suddenly felt small beside the quiet honesty between them. And as Margaret left the room, furious, the tabloids were already preparing their headline, "The Millionaire and the Maid." Love had just gone public. The morning after the gala, Beverly Hills was deceptively quiet. Behind every mansion's curtain, whispers traveled faster than the wind. The tabloids screamed in bold letters, "The Millionaire and the Maid, Lover Scandal." Photos of Ethan Grant holding Maria Lopez's hand dominated every cover, the flash of cameras echoing like an aftershock. For the elite, it wasn't just gossip, it was betrayal. Inside the Grant mansion, the atmosphere was heavy. Margaret Grant paced back and forth across the living room, newspaper in hand, her face drawn with tension. "You've stained our family name, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling with restrained fury. Her son, seated on the sofa, didn't reply immediately. The words echoed inside him, but they no longer carried the same weight. Something had changed. Perhaps because for the first time he wasn't ashamed of who he truly was. In the guest room, Maria sat in silence, holding the same newspaper. Her eyes moved down the page as though each line were a judgment. She had known this would happen, but not on such a scale. "Maybe it's better if I leave," she whispered, gazing out the window at the golden Californian horizon. Her heart tightened, not out of fear, but because she didn't want to bring pain to those she'd grown to love. Sophie, sensing the tension, was the first to act. She entered Maria's room and sat beside her without saying a word. "They don't know who you are," the girl said, her tone wiser than her years. Maria smiled softly but didn't answer. Their silence spoke volumes, a connection built not on words but on understanding. It was the kind of bond time could never erase. Meanwhile, Margaret continued her private war. She summoned her son to the office and demanded that he fire Maria. "People are talking, Ethan. Your reputation is at risk. You have companies, shareholders, responsibilities. This is unacceptable." But he, calm and resolute, replied, "Maybe the reputation I built means nothing if I have to pretend to be someone I'm not." For the first time, she had no reply. Just then, Margaret's phone rang. A close friend, alarmed, informed her that the family's name was all over the news. "They're saying the millionaire from Grant Holdings is involved with his cleaning lady." Margaret slowly sat down, her strength fading. The world she had built on appearances was collapsing, and she had no idea how to rebuild it. Elsewhere, Maria quietly began packing her things. Each folded piece of clothing felt like a farewell. She wrote a small letter to Ethan and Sophie, thanking them and explaining that she needed to leave to avoid more trouble. The simplicity of the gesture stood in stark contrast to the chaos outside. It was as if she were trying to return the peace she had once brought into their lives. By late afternoon, Ethan found her by the door, ready to go. His eyes held guilt and sorrow. "You don't have to leave," he said softly but firmly. Maria avoided his gaze, trying to hide her pain. "They're right, Ethan. I'm just a maid, and you're a Grant." The silence that followed was deeper than any argument, the weight of love and pride colliding in the same room. That night, the millionaire stood alone on the mansion's terrace. Beneath the orange sky, he thought about everything he'd lost while pretending to have control. For once, he didn't want to appear strong, he wanted to feel alive. In the distance, the city lights shimmered, and he thought of Maria, the woman whose gentleness had turned chaos into calm. The wind brushed against him softly, carrying an unspoken promise. Their story wasn't over yet. The Grant mansion was quiet, but the silence was different now. Not the weight of pride, then rather the stillness before something new begins. Ethan Grant, the millionaire, spent more time staring out the office window than reading his reports. Outside, the garden seemed to breathe differently since Maria Lopez, the cleaning lady, had left. Every corner of the mansion still carried her trace: the scent of coffee, the shine of a mirror, the echo of Sophie's laughter drifting down the hallway. That night, Ethan walked down to the kitchen, a place he almost never went. The kettle whistled softly, steam rising like a thought taking shape. He poured himself tea and sat alone at the table, something he hadn't done in years. The silence felt like company. Why does everything feel so different since she left? He wondered. Maybe because Maria hadn't just cleaned the house. She had cleansed something cold inside him. Meanwhile, Maria sat in her small apartment in East LA. The modest neighborhood contrasted sharply with the marble halls of Beverly Hills, yet her heart felt anything but peaceful. Daniel, her son, was asleep, and she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She kept trying to convince herself she had done the right thing. "He's a Grant and I'm just a maid," she repeated silently. But deep down she knew there was something between them that defied logic, something that grew in silence like a flower pushing through concrete. The next day, Ethan drove aimlessly. The wide streets and towering buildings meant nothing. He stopped at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city and ordered a plain espresso. No one recognized him, and it was liberating. The waiter treated him like anyone else, and for the first time in years, he felt human. He watched people laugh, talk, live, and thought of Maria, of how she belonged to that world of sincerity, where affection didn't depend on last names. Back at the mansion, Margaret Grant watched her son with quiet suspicion. Something in him had changed. He was no longer the man she had shaped. He was someone beginning to think with his heart. "You look tired," she said, her tone carefully composed. Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm just tired of pretending." It was the first time in years she didn't have a retort. Control was slipping away from her, and she feared the one thing she couldn't command: love. That night, Ethan picked up his phone. Maria's number glowed on the screen, but he hesitated. The sound of the wind outside seemed to whisper the words he couldn't say. When he finally pressed the button, his heart raced like a teenager's before a confession. On the other end, Maria's gentle voice answered. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. It was the kind of silence that said everything. The conversation was simple, yet charged with emotion. Ethan spoke of loneliness, how the mansion felt empty without her laughter, without Sophie's joy. Maria confessed her fear, of mistakes, of judgment, of loving something impossible. Neither used grand words, but every sentence filled a space inside the other. When the call ended, they both remained still, breathing the same invisible air of longing. Meanwhile, Margaret upstairs sensed what was happening. She saw her son from afar, speaking softly into the phone, his eyes glowing with something she hadn't seen in years. Maternal instinct mixed with fear of scandal. She knew exactly what was unfolding, and for the first time she realized she might lose her son not to death but to love. Quietly, she made a decision. She would end it before it began. Ethan, unaware of the storm gathering, closed his laptop and climbed the stairs. For the first time in years, his chest felt light, as if his heart had been allowed to breathe. Outside, the wind whispered through the garden trees, carrying a subtle promise that nothing would ever be the same. For the first time since his wife's death, the millionaire felt his heart beating, not in pain, but in hope. Rain fell softly over Beverly Hills, the kind of rain that seemed to wash away pride and reveal what truly mattered. Inside the Grant mansion, Maria Lopez packed her things in silence. The sound of raindrops tapping against the windows blended with the quiet zip of her suitcase. Each movement was a restrained goodbye, a farewell made of small gestures but deep emotion. She didn't cry. The strength of the maid had always been carrying pain in silence. Ethan Grant, the millionaire, walked down the hallway with heavy steps. There was something in his chest that made it hard to breathe. When he reached the living room, he saw Maria by the door. Her eyes lowered, her suitcase at her side. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. "You were going to leave without saying goodbye?" he asked, voice rough, caught between pride and despair. She lifted her gaze and replied softly, "Some goodbyes are easier when they're not spoken." Upstairs, Sophie watched from the shadows. Her young face was pale, eyes glassy with tears. She had already lost her mother. Now she felt she was losing the only person who had made her believe in love again. She ran down the stairs, but when she reached the hall, Maria was already walking through the rain. "Maria!" she shouted. Her voice cut through the storm like lightning, but Maria didn't look back. The front door closed slowly, leaving only the echo of the wind. Ethan stood frozen, staring at nothing. Margaret appeared moments later, composed but uneasy. "It was for the best," she said, voice cold and brittle. He didn't answer. His silence was more devastating than any argument. For the first time, Margaret realized her son didn't see her as his protector, but as the wall between him and happiness. Hours later, the mansion was drowned in darkness and grief. The rain outside was the only sign that time still moved. Sophie had locked herself in her room, refusing to speak to her father. Her pain mirrored his. In the middle of the night, a faint sound broke the stillness, and a window opening. Moments later, she was gone into the storm. All that remained was a damp note on her desk. "If Maria's gone, I'm leaving too." Panic took over the mansion. Ethan rushed into his daughter's room, the letter trembling in his hands. He ran through the halls shouting her name, his voice lost among thunder and wind. "Sophie," he cried, the sound echoing through the empty corridors, through the gates into the storm. Margaret, pale and motionless, watched in shock, finally realizing the magnitude of her mistake. For once, pride offered no protection. Meanwhile, in her small apartment, Maria tried to convince herself she had done the right thing. But her heart felt uneasy, restless. Then she turned on the TVs and froze. "Daughter of billionaire Ethan Grant missing during storm," the reporter announced. The remote slipped from her hand. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and keys and ran out into the rain. The mother, the woman, and the maid became one, moved by nothing but love. The streets were flooded, the lights reflecting on the wet asphalt. The wind whipped against her face, but she didn't stop. She followed her instinct as if her heart itself knew the way. After minutes of searching, she spotted a small figure curled up on a swing in an empty park. It was Sophie, drenched, trembling, crying. Maria ran toward her, dropped to her knees, and wrapped her in her arms without saying a word. Love spoke for her. When they returned to the mansion, soaked through, Ethan was standing by the doorway, his face streaked with rain and tears. The moment he saw them, he ran forward and pulled them both into his arms. Time stood still again. Margaret, watching from the staircase, felt her eyes fill with tears. In that moment, amidst the storm and the sorrow, she finally understood. The woman who had come to clean the house had cleansed something far deeper, the family's hearts. Dawn brought silence after the storm. The Grant mansion, which only hours ago had echoed with despair, was now filled with a different kind of quiet, the kind that follows a miracle. Maria, Lopez, and Sophie sat in the living room, wrapped in blankets, their hair still damp and their eyes heavy with exhaustion. The air smelled of fresh coffee and rain, as if the house itself were breathing again. And beside them, Ethan Grant, the millionaire, watched every detail with a heart both heavy and grateful. He said nothing, just looked. His eyes, once hardened by years of control and solitude, now carried the expression of a man who finally understood the value of loss and reunion. Maria, seated beside Sophie, held the girl's hand as though holding life itself. In that small gesture, Ethan saw what all his wealth had never given him: pure, unpretentious, real love. The house, once cold and silent, began to fill with a new sound, the sound of family. Margaret Grant descended the stairs slowly. Her elegant dress contrasted with her tired face, and her tearful eyes revealed the battle raging inside her. When she saw Maria and Sophie embraced, something inside her pride broke. For a brief moment, she no longer saw the maid, but the woman who had saved her granddaughter and, in a way, her own son. Words didn't come easily, but silence spoke for her. Prejudice had finally yielded to gratitude. Ethan stood and walked toward Maria. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the room, but no one breathed. He stopped in front of her, his eyes steady, his voice trembling. "I should have stopped you from leaving. I should have protected you from them, from everything." Maria lowered her gaze and answered softly, "You couldn't protect me from myself." The words lingered in the air like a confession, two hearts that had both made mistakes trying to shield themselves from pain. Sophie, still wrapped in her blanket, watched the scene with a shy smile. The girl who once screamed to be heard now just looked on, calm, finally understanding what love truly meant. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling. Ethan turned to her and she added, "Marry her." The nervous laughter that followed shattered the tension. Maria blushed, Margaret sighed, and Ethan, for the first time in years, laughed, freely and wholeheartedly. The morning carried on softly, filled with the aroma of bread and the sound of laughter from the kitchen. Maria, now more at ease, helped Sophie prepare breakfast. Ethan watched from a distance, his heart beating in a new rhythm. Margaret, seated at the table, pretended to read the newspaper, but glanced up every now and then, smiling discreetly. Something rare, almost miraculous. The maid who had once entered invisible was now the heart of a reborn home. When everyone sat down for breakfast, a sweet silence settled over the table. Ethan looked around at his daughter, his mother, and Maria, and felt perhaps for the first time that he was truly home. "You know what's funny?" he said with a quiet laugh. "I spent my whole life building walls to protect what was mine, and it was someone who came to clean them who showed me what love really is." Maria looked at him, surprised and moved. Sometimes love doesn't need to be spoken, only felt. Later that day, as the sun rose over the gardens of Beverly Hills, Margaret approached Maria. The two women stood in silence for a few seconds. Then, with tears in her eyes, Margaret whispered, "Thank you." There was no formality, no pride, only truth. Maria smiled, and in that instant the older woman realized what money could never buy: peace. By sunset, the Grant mansion was no longer the same. The walls seemed brighter, the laughter louder, and the air lighter. In the garden, Ethan and Maria sat side by side on a stone bench, watching the sky turn gold. He took her hand gently, their eyes meeting, calm, deep, and sincere. Their story hadn't begun with luxury, but with courage. And in that moment, the millionaire and the maid were no longer two separate worlds, but one heart, finally at peace. That morning, the sun seemed warmer than usual, as if even the weather had decided to smile upon the Grants. The mansion, now alive, breathed a new kind of energy. Ethan Grant, the millionaire who had once lived trapped between spreadsheets and silence, walked lightly, almost carefree. There was a quiet brightness in him, a blend of peace and nervous anticipation. Deep down, he knew this wasn't just another day. It was the beginning of a new chapter. Maria Lopez was in the kitchen, humming an old Spanish tune as she prepared breakfast. The scent of fresh bread filled the air. Her simplicity contrasted beautifully with the sophistication of the space, and somehow that contrast made everything more perfect. The maid who had once entered that house only to clean was now its very soul. Ethan stood by the door, watching her silently. Sometimes love doesn't need words, just the right kind of silence. Later that day, he appeared at the kitchen door holding 2 plane tickets. "Want to go out with me today?" he asked with a smile. Maria laughed, thinking he was joking. "Out? As my boss or as a man?" she teased. He stepped closer, his gaze both firm and tender. "As someone who's tired of pretending he doesn't love you." The words hung in the air like a truth that had waited far too long to be spoken. The next scene could have come straight from a movie. Ethan took Maria to a small restaurant tucked away in the streets of Los Angeles, the same place she used to visit with her son when life felt too heavy. The lights were soft. The air smelled of jasmine and wood smoke. Maria looked around, her eyes shining. "How did you know about this place?" she asked. He smiled. "Sophie told me. She said this was where you really laughed." As they dined, the conversation flowed easily. Ethan spoke of his mistakes, of the nights when wealth wasn't enough to silence the emptiness. Maria listened, calm and kind, never judging. In return, she shared the moments she'd wanted to give up, but couldn't because Daniel, her son, deserved a strong mother. The millionaire's eyes softened. He saw before him a woman who didn't love him for what he owned, but for who he was. Outside, the city glowed in golden reflections. Ethan, filled with quiet courage, reached into his pocket and took out a small box. The sound of the clasp opening was almost imperceptible. Inside lay a simple ring. No diamonds, just silver and a single clear stone. "I could give you the world," he said softly, "but all I want is to promise you something real." The sparkle in Maria's eyes said more than any word could. She hesitated for a moment. Not out of doubt, but out of emotion. Life had taught her to be wary of happy endings, but this moment was different. Ethan reached out his hand and time seemed to stop. The voices around them faded. The restaurant grew quiet. It was as if the universe itself held its breath. And then slowly she whispered, "Yes." Ethan's reaction was silent and sincere. He didn't speak. He simply stood, walked around the table, and kissed her gently. It wasn't the hurried kiss of passion, but the calm meeting of two souls that had finally found each other. The waiter turned away politely, smiling. Outside, the lights of Los Angeles reflected on the glass, as if even the city itself was celebrating this improbable moment between the millionaire and the maid. When they stepped out of the restaurant, the night was warm, the breeze gentle. Ethan wrapped his arm around her and they walked slowly through the glowing streets. Maria leaned her head on his shoulder, laughing softly as they passed the shop windows. "I never thought life could be this simple," she said. He replied, "Life was always simple. We're the ones who make it complicated." And in that quiet, a silent promise lingered, something yet to come. That night, the Grant mansion was brighter than usual. The windows shimmered with candlelight, and the faint sound of a string quartet drifted through the corridors. Margaret Grant had organized the dinner like someone preparing for battle. Every fork, every plate, every flower on the table had been placed with the precision of control she refused to lose. Yet the air carried something different. There was a quiet tension in the atmosphere that even luxury couldn't disguise, the kind that precedes truth. Maria Lopez, the maid who was now part of the family, walked through the hall in a simple sand-colored dress. Her long brown hair fell in soft waves, and her serene gaze contrasted with the nervousness she tried to hide. She felt out of place among the crystals and porcelain, yet her posture exuded dignity. The woman who once scrubbed those tables now sat beside them, not by chance but by right. Ethan Grant, the millionaire, appeared too calm for someone about to shock the entire room. Dressed in a light gray suit, he carried the composed confidence of a man who once commanded boardrooms. Only now, he wasn't here to talk business. His gaze rested on Maria with tenderness and complicity. Between them existed a silent language, one shared only by those who had known pain and found refuge in each other. The guests conversed politely, pretending not to notice the glances and whispers floating through the air. The dinner was impeccable, but the tension was palpable. Margaret, seated at the head of the table, wore a frozen smile. She knew something was coming. With every glance her son exchanged with Maria, her sense of foreboding deepened. That control, once her armor, was slipping away again. The clinking of glasses signaled the start of the toast. Ethan stood slowly, his eyes sweeping the room with the calm authority of a man who no longer needed approval. "I'd like to say a few words," he announced, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. The murmurs ceased. Maria lowered her gaze slightly, as if sensing what was about to unfold. Margaret straightened her back, ready to confront whatever came next. Silence fell across the hall. "For a long time, I believed success was about what I could buy," Ethan began. "But a man can have everything and still live empty." He paused, looked at Maria, and continued. "Then a woman walked into my house and showed me that true luxury is peace." The guests exchanged shocked glances. Margaret sat still, her fingers tightening around her glass. It was the kind of truth that even the wealthy struggled to swallow. Ethan reached out and invited Maria to stand. She hesitated, heart pounding, then rose beside him. Taking a deep breath, he smiled softly and declared, "This is the woman I love, my fiancée." The words echoed like a contained explosion. The once chatty room fell silent. Only the distant violin continued, soft and poetic. Maria, tears glimmering in her eyes, held his hand tightly. Margaret stood abruptly. Her elegant gown rippled with the movement, and the entire hall seemed to freeze. She said nothing, simply turned and walked away, her heels striking the marble like punctuation marks of finality. But before disappearing through the door, she glanced back. Her eyes, once cold and proud, now carried something new, the first spark of surrender. Ethan turned to Maria. Their eyes met and held. Around them, the guests began to clap, hesitant at first, then genuine. But in that moment, the applause was background noise. The candlelight reflected in their eyes, and everything else faded away. No wealth, no past, no masks, only love. The millionaire and the maid stood hand in hand, proof that some things money can never buy. And somewhere beyond that night, a new dawn was waiting. The mornings in the Grant mansion were never the same again. The place that once breathed silence and formality now woke up to laughter, the scent of fresh coffee, and the gentle hum of life unfolding. Maria Lopez, the maid who once passed unnoticed through marble corridors, now walked as someone who belonged there, not because of status, but because of love. The millionaire Ethan Grant, once buried in figures and business meetings, had discovered the true worth of time, sitting at the table and listening to the sound of family. Sunlight streamed through the wide windows, bathing the house in a soft golden glow. Sophie, the once rebellious teenager, now laughed beside Daniel, Maria's son. The two competed playfully over who could make the best pancake, and the kitchen, once reserved for staff, had become the heart of the home. Hierarchies had dissolved there, replaced by something simpler and far more valuable: belonging. In the garden, Ethan watched from a distance. The expensive suit had been replaced by a white shirt with rolled-up sleeves, and the once tense look in his eyes was now peaceful. He seemed like another man, not the powerful millionaire from the headlines, but someone who had finally learned that power doesn't live in control, but in surrender. Maria approached slowly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. When he looked at her, the world seemed to fall quiet for a moment. Her smile was the same as always, calm, warm, the kind that disarms pain. "Coffee, Mr. Grant?" she teased softly. He chuckled and replied, "I think that title doesn't suit me anymore." Their hands brushed, and for a second, everything they had lived, the loss, the fear, the prejudice, condensed into that simple touch. The maid and the millionaire were no longer opposites. They were equals. Margaret Grant from the upstairs window watched them in silence. There was no more coldness in her eyes, only nostalgia and acceptance. She remembered the times she tried to control her son's destiny, believing she was protecting the family's legacy. Now she saw that the true legacy wasn't kept in safes, but in the laughter echoing through the halls. She descended slowly, hand on the railing, following the sound of joy to the kitchen. When she entered, the room seemed to grow even brighter. Maria stood up, slightly embarrassed, while Sophie ran to her grandmother and wrapped her in a tight hug. Margaret, once uncomfortable with affection, felt her eyes fill with tears. "Thank you, Maria," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for bringing joy back to this house, and to my son." The maid smiled, discreetly wiping her tears. Sometimes life comes down to that, recognizing the miracle of someone who arrives without promising anything. The afternoon passed with laughter, stories, and plans. Daniel talked about wanting a dog, and Sophie insisted it had to be adopted. Ethan laughed, leaning on the counter, while Margaret watched quietly, taking in the scene she had once tried to prevent. Simple happiness. The camera of life had shifted focus, from luxury to love, from power to presence. As the sun began to set, Ethan and Maria walked into the garden. They sat side by side on the stone bench, surrounded by the flowers Sophie had planted. The wind was gentle, and the horizon glowed gold against the mansion's windows. "I never thought this place could have a soul," he said. Maria looked up at the sky and replied, "Every house does. It just needs someone to awaken it." The silence between them was full of meaning. Their hands touched again, and Ethan, with a serene gaze, whispered, "You know, sometimes I think you didn't come here to clean the house, but to clean our souls." Maria smiled and rested her head on his shoulder. The sunset wrapped them in warm colors, and the sound of laughter echoed softly through the mansion. The old coldness had vanished completely, and at last, the home was whole. And there, beneath the last glow of day, the millionaire and the maid proved what many spend a lifetime searching for: the peace of loving and being loved without measure. A new cycle had begun, and though there were no more battles to fight, the air carried something sweet. The quiet promise that some stories don't end. They simply keep blooming. The story of the millionaire and the maid is, at its heart, a reminder that life always rewards those who choose to feel. No matter how much the world tries to harden us, what truly transforms is what comes from the heart. A gesture of kindness, forgiveness, or a look that sees beyond appearances. Maria walked into that house to clean its floors, but ended up cleansing the soul of an entire family. And Ethan, the man who had everything, discovered that the real luxury is the peace of being loved without conditions. And now, maybe it's your turn. What part of your life still needs to be transformed by love, courage, or simplicity? Think about it. And if this story touched you, inspired you, or reminded you that beauty still hides in the unexpected, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who also needs to believe that the impossible can happen. Sometimes all it takes is one story like this to reignite everything fear once tried to silence.